little fifth graders. So as you can see, well, first of all, this is going to be for Wednesday, April 15th, I believe. It's Wednesday. All the days are running together, so, you know, I think it's April 22nd. But anyway, as you all can see, we are outside today, mainly because I am doing laundry. And if you all have ever been in your house while your parents do laundry, it gets extremely hot when you run the dryer. So I was getting hot, the gerbils were getting hot, so now we're outside enjoying the beautiful fresh air that God has given to us. So we are going to be continuing our Johnny Tremain. Now, if you remember, the Redcoats are finally marching. They are called the Scarlet Dragon, and basically the Battle of Lexington was basically just target practice for the British, because it was 700 British against 70 American colonists. So it wasn't even, it was just like they were just figuring out how many to kill. And thankfully, hardly any of them died, so that's a good thing. Anyway, so we are starting off on the part where Johnny is watching them go off to Concord and just trying to figure out what's actually going to happen. And we're going to start there. The hundreds gathered to see the departure of the brigade stood about gazing at the empty space they had occupied. Far away, growing faint and fainter, came wafting back the last sound of the tune they played. A man standing by Johnny with clenched hands and head thrust down and out like a bull's said thickly, "They go out by Yankee Doodle, but they'll dance to it before night." Johnny saw a group of women, and they were nodding their heads, whispering the prophecy, "Before night they'll be dancing." This catchphrase was everywhere. It did not seem to have gone from mouth to mouth, but from mind to mind. Old meetings struck 9. Earl Percy and his laggard brigade were gone. This day, this unreal day, in which Boston waited hour upon hour for news, any news, good or bad, was well begun. Suddenly, people were saying, "Have you heard? At sunrise this morning over at Lexington, the British fired on us." No one seemed to know where this rumor had started, but it was everywhere. Although half of Gage's forces had left town for the battlefield, there were more officers than usual hanging about the streets and taverns, and their faces were so bland and and they reassured the people so glibly that not a shot had been fired, not a person killed, and begged all the sundry to smoothly to keep calm and go to their shops or their homes. Johnny was confident that the British, as well as the inhabitants, had heard now that the war had begun. And by noon, little bands of soldiers appeared on the streets, going quickly from house to house. Too late, General Gage had given orders that the leaders of the opposition should be arrested. But the leaders were all gone. The angry, frustrated soldiers might scare Sam Adams's black handmaiden out of her wits. They could break John Hancock's fence, but these gentlemen had quietly left Boston a month before. They stormed into Joseph Warren's house. He was gone, and so was Paul Revere. Not one of the principal leaders was left, and seemingly no rebel printers. Isaiah Thomas's shop was empty. He had his press had left the night before. At Ed's and Gill's, where the Boston Gazette was published, they did grab young Peter Ed's. His father and press had been smuggled out to Watertown. Robert Newman, suspected of having hung the lanterns in Christchurch the night before, was thrown into jail, and John Pulling, merely suspected of having helped, was forced to hide in his grandmother's wine butt. Paul Revere's cousin was in jail, and every minute the temper of the soldiers was growing shorter, and a queer feeling of jubilation was apparent among the people. You couldn't see, you couldn't guess why they began feeling so confident. Confidence was in the air. As soon as Johnny heard that arresting parties were on the streets, he sent a message to Uncle Lorne. Uncle had best make himself scarce. Soon after, having stood about the jail and noted exactly who was put in it, he himself headed for Salt Lane. There was not a person on the street, but at every window he saw a face. The lane itself had changed. He glanced about him and saw what was wrong. There was no little man in a blue coat observing Boston through a spyglass. The familiar sign had been torn down, stamped to kindling. The door of the shop was shattered. He went in. The presses were broken, the type pied. Upstairs, his and Rab's bed had been ripped open by bayonets. Frightened, he ran across the street. Aunt Jennifer sat in her kitchen. Half in her lap and half on the floor was an enormous feather bed. She was peacefully sticking on it a new ticking. The only unusual thing was the great number of feathers. This deft housewife had carelessly spilled over her kitchen floor. Rabbit, enchanted with these new toys, was constantly picking up a feather, putting it in his hair, and saying, "Yankee Doo!" "They've been here?" asked Johnny. "Yes. Are they gone?" "Not one in sight. We got your message just as they were turning down Salt Lane." The feather bed began to heave on the floor. "You can come out now," Aunt Jennifer whispered to it. Out of the bottom rolled Uncle Lorne, choked with feathers and looking more bird than human. Rabbit shrieked, "Dada!" He evidently thought his father much improved. Still trembling, for Uncle Lorne was a timid man, he kissed his wife and hugged his child. "It was all I could think of," Aunt Jennifer said to Johnny. "Mr. Lorne just stood here and said he wasn't afraid to die. We could hear the men marching down the street. It was terrible. So I just popped him in the inn and went on sewing." "Were the soldiers rough?" "Rough? They were furious." "Good," said Johnny grimly. "That means they are really scared. Something pretty awful has happened to all those men Gage has sent out. Some of the officers may know already, but the men have guessed it, and they are running about with uniforms unbuttoned and yelling, 'If they want a war, we'll give it to them! And they won't pay taxes, we'll collect in blood!'" "You don't say! Are you sure the fight's going for us?" "Pretty sure. I was down by the ferry slip and saw a British major coming over from Charleston. Well, he had a civilian coat over his uniform, sort of disguised, and he tore off the boat and he ran for the province house. He'd come to tell Gage Colonel Smith's and Percy's men are getting licked." "Boy, you're jumping at conclusions." "Not I. I saw his face. It was just done in and tied up with disgust. His uniform was a mess. His feelings had been hurt. People who have been winning battles don't go around with faces like that. But British officers who have been beaten by peasants and yokels do." "Oh, Johnny, I do like to hear you talk like that, but I'm not counting much on one man's face. Where are you off to?" "Beacon Hill. I have an idea that Major got back to Gage to tell him one thing. The British are going to try to get to Charleston, just the way he did, and under protection of the Somerset's guns. They won't backtrack the way they came. Too dangerous. If I've guessed it right, before long from Beacon Hill, we'll be able to see them, running, and our men after them. Johnny, here's half a mince pie for you. You're a real smart boy." Uncle Lorne came back from the bedroom where he, with Rabbit's help, had been picking off feathers. "Even if they hang me," he said in a proud tremolo, "I will feel I have not lived in vain." He was still pretty scared. Out of the street, Johnny met officers yelling at their men, trying to get them back into their barracks, striking at them even with the flat of their swords. You couldn't say the British regulars lacked fight. All they could talk about was how many skulking cowards they were going to kill. In one day, all was changed in Boston. On both sides, the gloves were off, and the hands were underneath their bloody. War had begun. The pastures and orchards back of Beacon Hill were crowded, and all eyes turned northward. Johnny was not the only person who had guessed that Percy would not attempt to get the remains of Smith's troops and his own brigade back through Cambridge, but only to Charleston, where they could be protected from the Somerset's guns. Then Johnny saw, running down Cambridge Road through the bushes of Charleston Common, a scurry of red ants. Had he really seen them or imagined them? But all about him, people were exclaiming, "Look, there they are!" Those red ants were British soldiers. To his left, the last moment of sunset light was dying. The day had been amazingly warm, but with night a fresh breeze came up off the ocean. Lights began to glimmer in Charleston and on warships. Seemingly, there was nothing more to be seen from Beacon Hill. Silently, people turned to go to their houses. "Look!" Johnny cried. You could see the flash of musket fire, too, far away to be heard, fireflies swarming, hardly more than that. Getting 2,000 men, or what was left of them, for gossip was saying they had been well chewed, into boats and back to Boston would create just the confusion Dr. Warren had promised, but it would not be easy for Johnny to slip over. The soldiers were cross and frightened. He would wait a little until they were more relaxed, say about midnight. Before him, lighted from top to bottom, he saw the Lights house, and he remembered Pumpkin's uniform. Dressed in that, he might slip aboard in the confusion. He went to the Lights. In front of the house, he saw wagons and carts and men loading them with furniture, chests, trunks, boxes, even old portraits. The Lights were moving, and by night, and in a hurry. He went to the kitchen door. Mrs. Beasy, who certainly ought to have been superintending this moving, was sitting idly in the kitchen, doing nothing. Selah sat beside her. She was doing nothing. Mrs. Bessie jerked her thumb toward the front of the house. "Scared," she said. "They're all going to London until this insurrection, as they call it, is over. The Unicorn leaves at dawn tomorrow. Gage has given permission." "Selah," said Johnny, "don't you go with them?" "Never. We all had a terrible fight this afternoon when word first came that us Yankees had beaten them hollow. All the other servants are Tories and are going with them, but Mrs. Bessie and I are Whigs, and we are not going with them. In the end, Mr. Light said he was glad we are Whigs because he will leave us here to look after his property. Gage has promised nothing up here will be touched." "But they don't want us around, can't bear the sight of us," Mrs. Bessie said smugly. "The very sight of a good Whig makes them furious." Mr. Light did have another fit, just a little one. "Miss Lavina is afraid if she doesn't get her papa right out of town and off to London, he'll die. She always did like London better than Boston anyway. They are leaving tonight and fast. What's Isana going to do?" "Is he?" Mrs. Bessie's lips curled. "She'll go with them." "She will not," said Selah. "Miss Lavina has gone down to Hancock's Wharf to ask me to let her take her, but Ma couldn't give her away, just as though she was a kitten." Miss Lavina was standing in a doorway from the dining room to the kitchen. She had on a black cloak with the hood on to it over her head. She stood a moment looking about and said nothing. Johnny was on his feet. He knew he would never forget her. Never. Even when he was an old man, he would remember Lavina Light standing, framed in the doorway, saying nothing. Her eyes were angry and tired. The chisel mark was deep between the low, sweeping black brows. He had never seen her look so worn and old, and never been more aware of her beauty. "Isana is going with me," she said at last. "Your mother, Selah, has too many kittens." "Miss Lavina," said Selah, "you can't do that." "Can't? Your mother signed the paper, and you're a wicked girl to stand in the way of your sister's good fortune." A little diffidently, Isana herself emerged from behind the lady's great dark skirts. "Isana," said Selah gently, "you can't go off and leave me like this. It's no matter what mother says. Look, dear, if you go to London, maybe you will never come back. Isana, don't go away from me." Lavina was smiling under her dark hood. "I will leave the decision entirely to her. She shall be perfectly free to choose between us. Precious, would you rather go with me to London and be a great lady and wear silks and jewels and ride in coaches, or stay here and be just another poor working girl?" And then, to make the choice doubly hard for the child, she added a little maliciousness, Which do you love most, Seela or me? Still, Asana said nothing, but even in her silence, Johnny could detect something of her desire for drama. At the moment, silence was more dramatic than anything she could say. Izzy is no good, thought Johnny. She'll go. Seela was standing quietly well away from the child. She was too proud to make any further appeal to her. Perhaps, like Johnny, she knew what the answer would be. Well, said Lavina, I haven't got all day. Which do you love the most? Isana began to cry. It was perfectly natural crying. Not even Johnny could believe it was done for effect. I don't know, she sobbed. Which would you rather be, a common person like your sister, or a fine lady? And we will stop there, because you all have to wait till tomorrow to figure out if Isana is going to betray her sister and follow Miss Light, or if she's actually going to surprise her sister and actually stay with her. So don't forget to take your 5-question quiz at the end of this, and I will see you all later. Okay, bye.